A single glass of champagne. That's all it took to shatter a perfect life. For Olivia Bennet, it was supposed to be a night of celebration, a moment to finally share the secret she held close, the new life growing inside her. But her husband, Nicholas Valmont, had a secret of his own. In the glittering ballroom of New York's most exclusive charity gala, surrounded by their closest friends and the city's elite, he wouldn't just break her heart. He would try to obliterate her soul. He paraded his betrayal in a designer dress, thinking his pregnant wife was nothing more than a footnote in his grand story. But he forgot one crucial detail, a billion-dollar secret buried in a dusty old ledger, a secret that was about to turn this tale of heartbreak into the most epic story of revenge you have ever heard. Olivia Bennet believed in the architecture of a perfect life. She and her husband, Nicholas Valmont, had built theirs in a sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park, a palace of glass and steel where the city lights glittered below like a carpet of fallen stars. Their life was a carefully curated collection of successes. Nick, the charismatic CEO of Ethelred Tech, a company he'd inherited and rebranded into a modern powerhouse. And Olivia, the brilliant but unassuming art historian, whose quiet support was the invisible scaffolding holding up his world. To their friends, they were the golden couple. Nick, with his sharp suits, confident smile, and a laugh that could fill any room, was the engine. Olivia, with her serene grace, gentle wit, and an uncanny ability to remember the names of everyone's children, was the heart. She organized the flawless dinner parties, charmed the stodgy board members' wives, and edited his late-night speeches until they shone. She was in his own frequent words, his better half his rock. But lately the rock had begun to feel the strain of erosion. The late nights at the office became more frequent, explained away by a difficult merger or a demanding new project. The scent of an unfamiliar, cloyingly sweet perfume clung to his suit jackets, which he'd blame on a huggy European investor. His phone, once left carelessly on the nightstand, was now perpetually face down or in his pocket, guarded like a state secret. Olivia, 3 months pregnant, and still guarding the secret with a quiet, joyful anticipation, chose to believe him. It was easier. The alternative was a crack in the foundation of their perfect life, a crack she wasn't ready to face. She attributed his distance to the immense pressure he was under. Ethelred Tech was his family's legacy, and his father's shadow loomed large. She told herself that once this big merger was finalized, he would be hers again. This evening was supposed to be a return to form. The annual Starlight Foundation Gala at the Metropolitan Club on Fifth Avenue was the crown jewel of the New York social calendar. It was an event where fortunes were pledged and reputations were cemented. For Olivia, it was something more. It was the night she would finally tell Nick about the baby. She had imagined the moment 1,000 times. They'd be on the terrace, the cool night air around them, the city's hum a distant melody. She would take his hand, place it on her still flat stomach, and watch his eyes light up, chasing away the shadows that had gathered there for months. Wear the navy blue gown, Nick had said that morning, barely looking up from his tablet. The one from the fundraiser in Milan. It makes you look statuesque. She smiled a small, genuine smile. I was thinking the emerald silk. It's new. He finally looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her in a way that felt more like an appraisal than a loving glance. No, the navy. It's classic. We need to project stability tonight. Peterson from the board will be there with his wife. He said it with a finality that brooked no argument. So the navy gown it was. As she stood before the full-length mirror, the deep blue fabric shimmering under the recessed lighting, she felt a pang of unease. The dress felt like a uniform for the role of Mrs. Valmont, a role she had played with devotion. She ran a hand over her abdomen. Soon there would be a new role, mother. The thought gave her a surge of strength. Tonight everything would change for the better. Nick walked into the dressing room already in his tuxedo. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine, devastatingly handsome and radiating an almost aggressive confidence. He adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes on his own reflection. "You look perfect, Liv," he said, the compliment feeling rehearsed. He walked over and kissed her cheek, a dry, passionless gesture. "The car is waiting. Let's not be late. I need to have a word with Gerald Feinstein before the auction starts." As they rode the silent elevator down to the lobby, Olivia rehearsed the words in her mind. "Nick, I have something wonderful to tell you. We're going to be a family." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against the bars of a gilded cage. She was so lost in her hopeful daydream that she didn't notice the way Nick was checking his watch, a flicker of something, not excitement, but a cold, sharp anxiety in his eyes. The perfect life was still standing, but the tremors were getting stronger, and Olivia was about to find out she was standing directly on the fault line. The Metropolitan Club was a bastion of old New York, a place where fortunes were generations deep, and the air was thick with the scent of money power and expensive perfume. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen tears from the impossibly high ceilings, and the murmur of the city's elite filled the grand ballroom. Olivia felt a familiar sense of calm settle over her as they entered. This was her world, or at least the one she had adopted. She smiled and nodded at familiar faces, the perfect hostess even on her husband's arm. "There's Gerald," Nick said, his grip on her elbow tightening. "Go say hello to Judith Peterson. Keep her occupied. You know how she loves to talk about her garden." He gave her a dismissive pat on the arm and strode off into the crowd before she could reply. Left alone, Olivia took a deep breath. She made her way through the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns, exchanging pleasantries with an easy grace. She found Judith Peterson by the silent auction tables and listened patiently to a 20-minute monologue about the challenges of growing heirloom tomatoes in a rooftop garden. Through it all, her eyes scanned the room for Nick waiting for the right moment. An hour later, the auction was about to begin, and guests were being ushered to their tables. Olivia found theirs table 1 front and center, but Nick was still absent. A few of their friends, a couple named Robert and Patricia Langley, were already seated. "Olivia, you look divine," Patricia said, air-kissing both of her cheeks. "Where's the man of the hour? Closing a deal?" I'm sure Robert chuckled, raising his glass. Nick never stops. Olivia's polite smile was beginning to feel brittle. Her gaze swept the grand entrance one more time, and that's when she saw him. He was standing under the magnificent archway, bathed in the warm glow of the sconces. He was laughing that big room-filling laugh of his. But he wasn't alone. On his arm was a woman Olivia had never seen before. She was younger, with sleek, raven-black hair, cut in a severe bob, and a predatory confidence that seemed to radiate from her. She was wearing a crimson dress, a slash of defiant color, in a room of elegant navies and blacks. The dress was daringly low-cut, clinging to her like a second skin. It was the kind of dress designed not just to be seen, but to make a statement. For a moment, Olivia's mind refused to process the image. It had to be a business associate, a client. There were 100 logical explanations. But then, Nick leaned down and whispered something in the woman's ear, his lips brushing her skin. The woman tilted her head back and laughed a sound that was sharp and triumphant. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart, and left it there. It was a gesture of such casual, profound intimacy that the air left Olivia's lungs in a sudden, painful rush. The room began to tilt. The murmur of the crowd faded into a dull roar in her ears. People were starting to notice. Heads were turning, whispers spreading through the room like a virus. They were all looking at Nick and the woman in red, and then their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity were flicking to her. To the wife. At table 1, Nick, seemingly oblivious or worse, completely indifferent to the unfolding social carnage, began to lead the woman into the ballroom. Not towards a discreet corner table, but directly towards his own. Directly towards Olivia. Robert Langley's jaw was slack. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. They watched frozen as Nicholas Valmont, CEO of Ethelred Tech, paraded his mistress in front of his friends, his colleagues, his entire world, and brought her straight to the table where his pregnant wife was sitting. He stopped before her, his smile unwavering, though it didn't reach his eyes. Those were cold appraising. "Olivia," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I'd like you to meet Bianca Reed. She's the new head of our strategic development department, an absolute rock star. Bianca, this is my wife, Olivia." Bianca Reed's eyes, a cool, calculating shade of grey, raked over Olivia. There was no apology in them, no shame. Only a clear, undisguised victory. She extended a hand with blood-red nails. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," she purred, her voice dripping with insincerity. "Nick has told me so much about you." Olivia couldn't breathe. Her own hand remained in her lap, trembling. The champagne glass on the table in front of her seemed to mock her. The perfect night, the wonderful news. It all dissolved into this single brutal public humiliation. Her secret, the joyful news of their child, felt like a lead weight in her stomach, a vulnerability she was suddenly desperate to hide. She looked at Nick, her eyes pleading, searching for some explanation, a sign that this was a monstrous misunderstanding. But she found nothing, only a chilling detachment. It was then she understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. He wasn't just leaving her, he was erasing her. He was showing everyone that she was disposable, and this new, sharp, ambitious woman was her replacement. Slowly, deliberately, Olivia rose to her feet. The entire table, and it seemed the entire ballroom, held its breath. For a heartbeat, a wild, primal scream built in her chest. She wanted to rage, to throw the champagne in his smug face, to expose him for the monster he was. But then she felt a faint, deep flutter within her. A tiny, insistent reminder of the life she was protecting. And in that moment, something shifted. The heartbreak, sharp and blinding, didn't vanish, but it was joined by a current of ice-cold clarity. She would not give him the satisfaction of a scene. She would not be the hysterical, scorned wife. She looked not at Bianca, but directly into her husband's eyes. She held his gaze until he was the one who looked away first. Then, without a single word, she turned. With a dignity she didn't know she possessed, her back straight. Her head held high. Olivia. Bennett Valmont walked out of the ballroom, away from the whispers, the pitying stares and the ruins of her perfect life, leaving the man who was the father of her unborn child standing beside his mistress in the wreckage. The taxi ride back to the penthouse was a blur of smeared city lights and a suffocating silence. Olivia walked through the opulent apartment that had once been her home and now felt like a stranger's museum. Every object, the photos on the mantelpiece, the books she'd lovingly arranged, the art she had chosen, was a monument to a lie. She didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hollow thing that had settled in her bones. She packed a single bag with numb efficiency, a few changes of clothes, a toothbrush, her laptop. She paused by the small antique writing desk in the corner of their bedroom. Inside, beneath a stack of stationery, was a small velvet box. She opened it. It was the positive pregnancy test and the first ultrasound picture, a grainy black and white image of a tiny flickering promise. She had been going to gift it to Nick tonight. She snapped the box shut and put it in her purse. This secret was hers alone now. She didn't go to her parents in Connecticut. She couldn't bear their well-meaning sympathy, the questions she couldn't answer. Instead, she took a car service 2 hours north, deep into the Hudson Valley, to the one place she knew she would be safe, her grandfather's house. Her grandfather, Arthur Bennett, had passed away 2 years prior. He was a quiet, unassuming man, a retired history professor who had preferred dusty books to stock portfolios. His house was a reflection of him, a rambling old stone house set on 50 acres of overgrown woods, filled with the scent of old paper lemon polish and pipe tobacco. It was a place of solitude and memory. For the first week, Olivia did nothing. She slept in her grandfather's guest room, the silence of the house a stark contrast to the roar in her head. She walked the wooded paths, the crunch of leaves under her feet, the only sound. She let the grief wash over her in waves, allowing herself to feel the full, crushing weight of Nick's betrayal. The humiliation of that night played on a loop in her mind, each detail a fresh stab of pain. She was adrift, a ghost in her own life. On the 8th day, a storm rolled in, trapping her inside. Restless and raw, she found herself drawn to her grandfather's study. It was a room he had rarely let anyone into, his private sanctuary. It was just as he had left it. Books on military history and economic theory were stacked from floor to ceiling. On his large oak desk sat an old leather-bound ledger, a relic from another era. Idly she opened it. The pages were filled with her grandfather's neat, precise handwriting. At first she thought they were historical notes, but then she saw the names General Electric, IBM, Procter & Gamble, and dates and numbers, lots of them. Buy orders, sell orders, dividend reinvestment plans. It wasn't a history book. It was a meticulously kept record of a stock portfolio stretching back 50 years. Curiosity piqued, she started digging deeper into his desk. In a locked bottom drawer, for which she found the key in a small carved wooden box, she found a series of newer, professionally bound portfolio statements, and a letter addressed to her in his familiar script. Her hands trembled as she opened it. My dearest Olivia, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have found yourself in need of this room. I always hoped you never would. You see the world through the lens of art and beauty, a gift I have always admired. I, on the other hand, have always seen it through the lens of numbers and systems. It is a duller view, perhaps, but a useful one. The man you knew as a quiet history professor was only part of the story. In my youth I made a few fortunate investments. I learned that true power isn't loud, it's silent. It doesn't sit on a throne, it owns the throne. Over the decades I cultivated this power not for myself, but as a safeguard. For our family. For you. This portfolio is now yours. It is managed by a trust, the Bennett Trust. It is substantial, more than you can imagine. But there is one investment I must draw your attention to. It was a risk of favor to an old friend, a man named George Valmont. Olivia's breath hitched. George Valmont. Nick's father. George was a brilliant engineer but a terrible businessman. When he founded his little tech company, I backed him. Silently, through a series of holding companies. Over the years, as his Ethelred tech grew, my stake grew with it. When he passed his son, Nicholas inherited the CEO title and his father's shares, but he never knew the identity of the company's largest silent partner. He never knew that a quiet history professor in the Hudson Valley held the controlling interest. Olivia had to sit down. The room spun. She looked at the most recent statement from the Bennett Trust. The numbers were staggering, a constellation of assets that ran into the billions. And there it was at the very top of the list, the largest single holding Ethelred Technologies Inc., 51% ownership. She was the majority shareholder. She owned the company. The letter continued. I had my reservations about Nicholas. He has his father's ambition, but lacks his integrity. I hoped your goodness would temper his arrogance. Perhaps it has. But if it has not, and if he has ever made you feel small, I am giving you this, my dear girl. It is not just money. It is a shield, a sword, and a fortress. Use it wisely. Contact my lawyer, a man named Samuel Davies, of Davies and Finch in the city. He knows everything. He is utterly discreet and fiercely loyal. He has been waiting for your call. Be strong, Olivia. You are a Bennett. We are not the type to be erased. Olivia dropped the letter, her body shaking, not with grief, but with something new. A powerful, terrifying, electrifying surge of adrenaline. The hollow space inside her began to fill with a white-hot fire. Nick had tried to humiliate her, to cast her aside like a broken object. He paraded his mistress, believing he held all the cards, that she was nothing without him. He had built his kingdom on her grandfather's money. He had used her family's legacy to fund the very life with which he had betrayed her. The ghost of the quiet history professor had just handed his granddaughter an arsenal. The tears that finally came were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of rage, of focus, and of a dawning, terrible resolve. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. While Olivia was discovering her inheritance, Nicholas Valmont was thriving. In his mind, the gala had been a resounding success. He had excised the weak link Olivia with surgical precision and simultaneously introduced his vibrant, ruthless new partner, Bianca Reed. The whispers that followed were not to him a source of shame, but a confirmation of his power. Only a man at the absolute top of his game could afford to be so bold. He had sent Olivia a single curt text message the morning after the gala. My lawyers will be in touch about the arrangements. I trust you'll be civil. He received no reply. Her silence, he concluded, was an admission of defeat. He pictured her crying at her parents' home in Connecticut, a tragic, weak figure he could now safely pity from a distance. The thought that she might be capable of anything other than heartbreak never once crossed his mind. His entire focus was on his magnum opus, the acquisition of a rival tech firm, Cybercore Dynamics. It was a massive, highly leveraged deal, one that the more conservative members of the Ethelred board, particularly the old guard loyal to his father's memory, had balked at. They saw it as a reckless gamble. Nick saw it as his coronation, the move that would finally eclipse his father's legacy and make him a legend in the industry. Bianca was his chief architect in this campaign. Her official title was Head of Strategic Development, but her real role was Nick's enforcer and ego stroker. She was brilliant immoral and completely devoted to the acquisition, largely because the commission and stock options tied to it would make her phenomenally wealthy. Peterson is still waffling, Bianca said, pacing Nick's expansive office. She was a bolt of energy, a stark contrast to Olivia's serene presence. He keeps talking about fiduciary duty and shareholder value. The old dinosaur doesn't have the stomach for a fight. Nick leaned back in his leather chair, a portrait of unbothered confidence. Don't worry about Andrew Peterson. He's a relic. His loyalty was to my father, not the company's future. Once the deal is done, he and the rest of his cronies will be singing my praises. We need his vote to be secure. Nick, She pressed her tone sharp. "And Ms. Chen is on the fence. She's worried about the debt load we'll be taking on. I'll handle Chen." He waved a dismissive hand. "I'll take her to dinner, at per se charm her a little. It always works." He paused, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's a shame Olivia isn't here. She was always so good at smoothing things over with the board wives. A quaint but useful skill." The casual cruelty of the remark hung in the air. To Nick, Olivia had been a tool, a useful appliance for managing the softer, more tedious aspects of his life. Now that she was gone, he barely registered her absence beyond these minor inconveniences. What he failed to grasp was the deep-seated structure of his own company. He saw himself as an absolute monarch, but Ethelred Tech was a public corporation with a board of directors and, most importantly, shareholders. While he held his father's significant block of shares, it was less than a controlling interest. He had always relied on the tacit support of a large anonymous block of shares, held in a truster block that had always voted with management, with his father, and subsequently with him. He assumed this support was a permanent feature of the landscape, as reliable as the sunrise. He never once bothered to investigate the identity of the Bennett Trust, dismissing it as some dusty institutional fund. His plan was simple: call an emergency board meeting, use a combination of charisma and brute force to push the Cybercore acquisition vote through, and then celebrate his victory. He instructed his assistant to schedule the meeting for the following Wednesday. "This is it, B," he said, pulling Bianca onto his lap. "In 1 week we'll be running the biggest tech firm on the East Coast, and you'll be right by my side." And Olivia Bianca asked, her voice a low purr as she traced the line of his jaw. "Olivia will receive a very generous settlement and fade into obscurity," he said with absolute certainty. "She'll probably remarry some boring professor and spend her days talking about pottery. It's what she's built for." The day before the board meeting, Nick received a registered letter from a law firm he didn't recognize, Davies and Finch. He opened it with mild curiosity, assuming it was from Olivia's new divorce attorney. The letter was brief and formal. It was a legal notification. "Dear Mr. Valmont, please be advised that pursuant to Article 3, Section 4 of the Ethelred Technologies, Inc., corporate bylaws, our client, the primary representative of the Bennett Trust, will be attending the emergency board meeting scheduled for Wednesday, September 17th. The representative will be exercising the Trust's full voting rights in all matters brought before the board. Sincerely, Samuel Davies, senior partner." Nick read it twice. The Bennett Trust. Why, after decades of silent proxy voting, would they suddenly send a representative in person? It was an anomaly, an irritating wrinkle in his perfect plan. "Who the hell are these people?" he muttered, tossing the letter onto his desk. "What is it?" Bianca asked. "The big silent partner, the Bennett Trust, is sending a rep to the meeting tomorrow." First time in history. He shrugged his arrogance, a thick shield against any real concern. Probably some stuffy old banker who wants to feel important. "It doesn't matter. They've always voted with us. It's a formality." He picked up the phone and buzzed his assistant. "Jessica, one more for the board meeting tomorrow. A representative from the Bennett Trust." "No, I don't have a name. Just put a placeholder on the seating chart and order the good coffee. We'll want to be in a celebratory mood." He hung up his mind, already moving on to the victory speech he would give. The king, secure in his castle, never once thought to check who was standing at the gates, holding the deed to the entire kingdom. He was about to learn that relics, old loyalties, and quiet, unassuming wives could be more dangerous than he ever imagined. In the serene quiet of her grandfather's study, Olivia Bennett was undergoing a profound transformation. The heartbroken wife was being systematically replaced by a calculating and formidable strategist. The room, once a place of refuge and grief, had become her war room. Her days were a rigorous, self-imposed boot camp in corporate governance. She didn't just read the files her grandfather had left, she devoured them. Balance sheets, profit and loss statements, market analyses, shareholder reports from the last 20 years. What had once seemed like an impenetrable language of numbers began to resolve into a clear picture of the company Nick was so carelessly gambling with. Her guide in this new world was Samuel Davies. He was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes, a razor-sharp mind, and an almost fanatical loyalty to her grandfather's memory. He flew up to the Hudson Valley the day after she called, bringing with him boxes of documents and a lifetime of wisdom. "Your grandfather wasn't just an investor, Olivia," he explained, his voice gentle but firm as they sat by the fireplace. "He was a builder. He believed in creating value, not just chasing profits. He saw Ethelred as a testament to innovation, a legacy for his friend George. He would be displeased by its current trajectory." Davies laid out Nick's proposed acquisition of Cybercore. He didn't use emotional language. He used numbers. He showed her the mountain of debt the company would have to take on. He pointed out the redundancies in their tech, the culture clash that would inevitably follow, and the obscene personal payout Nick and his executive team would receive if the deal went through regardless of its long-term success. "It's not a merger," Davies concluded, his expression grim. "It's a raid. Nicholas is gutting the company his father built to service his own ego." A cold fury settled in Olivia's heart. This wasn't just about her humiliation anymore. It was about legacy, her grandfather's Nick's father's, and now the one she would build for her child. She also made another call to a number Davies had given her, the number of Andrew Peterson, the dinosaur on the board Nick so casually dismissed. Peterson had been Ethelred's chief financial officer for 30 years under George Valmont, and had stayed on the board out of loyalty to his old friend. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice steady. "My name is Olivia Bennett. Arthur Bennett was my grandfather." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then a voice thick with emotion. "I knew it. I always wondered. Arthur was a great man, the finest man I ever knew. My God, his granddaughter." Olivia spent an hour on the phone with Peterson. He confirmed everything Davies had suspected. Nick was bullying the board, misrepresenting data, and rushing the vote before anyone could conduct proper due diligence. "He's arrogant, Mrs. Valmont," Olivia Peterson said, his voice heavy. "He thinks we're all fools. He has this young woman, this Bianca Reed, feeding him exactly what he wants to hear. There's something about her. I don't trust her. She's too slick." That was when Olivia asked the question that would change everything. "Mr. Peterson, can you look into her discreetly? Her work history, her connections? Anything?" "Consider it done," he replied without hesitation. For the next few days, Olivia and Davies worked relentlessly. They built their counter-argument, a precise, data-driven dismantling of the Cybercore deal. They prepared motions, drafted new resolutions, and mapped out the procedural intricacies of a corporate board meeting. Olivia, the art historian who once curated exhibits, was now curating a boardroom coup. She was no longer hiding. She was preparing. The pain of Nick's betrayal hadn't vanished, but she had learned to channel it. It was no longer a debilitating grief. It was fuel. Every time she felt a pang of sadness, she would look at the ultrasound picture she kept on the desk. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the future, for a legacy of integrity her child could be proud of. The evening before the meeting, Andrew Peterson called. His voice was tight with urgency. "Olivia, you were right to be suspicious. It's worse than we thought. Bianca Reed didn't just come from our competitor Omnicorp. It seems she never really left. "What do you mean?" Olivia asked, her pen pausing over a spreadsheet. "I hired a private investigator, a former FBI guy. He found encrypted emails, financial records. She's been feeding Ethelred's proprietary R&D data to Omnicorp for the last 6 months, specifically our new AI-driven logistics patent. It's the crown jewel of the company. The Cybercore deal, it's a smoke screen. The debt would cripple Ethelred, making it vulnerable. Omnicorp would then swoop in, buy us for pennies on the dollar, and get our patent for a fraction of its worth. Bianca was promised a senior vice president position and a 7-figure signing bonus." Olivia felt a chill go down her spine. Nick wasn't just being betrayed by his mistress. He was the pawn in her much larger, more devastating game. His arrogance and ego had made him the perfect tool for a rival company to use to destroy his own. "Do you have proof?" Olivia asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Irrefutable," Peterson confirmed. "Digital forensic reports, bank transfers. It's all here." Olivia looked at Samuel Davies, who had been listening on speakerphone. His expression was grim but resolute. This changed the stakes entirely. "Thank you, Andrew," Olivia said. "Bring everything you have tomorrow. Don't say a word to anyone." After she hung up, she walked to the window and looked out at the dark woods. The storm had passed, and the night was clear and cold. For the first time in weeks, her mind was completely still. She knew exactly what she had to do. She wasn't just going to stop a bad deal, she was going to clean house. She placed a hand on her stomach. The quiet general was ready for battle, and she was going to take no prisoners. The Ethelred Technologies boardroom was on the 50th floor, a sleek, sterile space designed to convey power. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the grey morning sky. At the head of it sat Nicholas Valmont, looking every bit the triumphant king. He was laughing with a board member to his right, radiating a confidence that bordered on smugness. Bianca Reed was not on the board, but she was present, seated in a chair just behind Nick's like a consigliere. She wore a sharp, tailored white suit, a stark contrast to her scandalous red dress from the gala, but projecting the same aura of untouchable ambition. She reviewed her notes on a tablet, a small, knowing smile on her lips. They were a team, a power couple, and this meeting was to be their coronation. The other board members filed in a collection of stern-faced men and women in expensive suits. There was Miss Chen, her brow furrowed with concern, and Andrew Peterson, who looked unusually grim, his jaw set. Nick greeted them with practiced charm, undeterred by their somber mood. He knew he had the votes. It would be tight, but it would pass. "Good morning, everyone." Nick began, his voice booming with authority. "Let's get started. We have an exciting and transformative opportunity to discuss today. The Cybercore acquisition will position Ethelred as the undisputed leader in our sector for decades too." He was cut short by the sound of the boardroom doors opening. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was a woman they all recognized, but a version of her they had never seen before. It was Olivia. But this was not the gentle, smiling Olivia who hosted their charity dinners. This woman was poised and formidable. She wore a simple but impeccably tailored grey dress that conveyed authority, not victimhood. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, severe style. Her face was pale and composed, but her eyes, which had always been warm and soft, were now like chips of ice. They held a clarity and a power that was utterly arresting. Flanking her was an older, distinguished gentleman with a leather briefcase, Samuel Davies. A shocked silence fell over the room. The board members stared, their mouths agape. Bianca Reed's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion and alarm. Nick was the most stunned of all. He shot to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Olivia, what in God's name are you doing here? This is a closed board meeting." Security. Olivia didn't flinch. She met his enraged gaze with a look of utter calm. "I believe I have a right to be here, Nicholas. You have no rights here," he spat, his voice rising. "This is my company, my boardroom." Samuel Davies stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the mahogany table with a quiet, definitive thud. "On the contrary, Mr. Valmont," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "My client, Mrs. Valmont, is not here as your wife." He opened the briefcase and began to methodically place a series of documents in front of Nick's seat. Each one landed with a soft, damning slap. "She is here in her capacity as the sole trustee and representative of the Bennett Trust." The name hung in the air, an unexploded bomb. Andrew Peterson looked down at his notes, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Ms. Chen's eyes widened in dawning comprehension. Nick stared at the documents, then back at Olivia, his mind refusing to connect the dots. The Bennett Trust. That's impossible. That's some investment fund. The Bennett Trust. Olivia said, her voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the silent room, was founded by my grandfather, Arthur Bennett. It is and has been, since this company's inception, the majority shareholder of Ethelred Technologies. She walked slowly, deliberately towards the table. The other board members seemed to shrink back in their chairs, making way for her. She was no longer just Nick's wife. She was the room's center of gravity, the undisputed locus of power. "You've been voting with my grandfather's proxies for your entire career, Nicholas. You just never bothered to ask who you were thanking." She stopped, not at the end of the table, but at a chair directly opposite him, taking her seat with a quiet grace that was more intimidating than any shout. Davies sat beside her, her silent, formidable counsel. The color drained from Nick's face. The swagger, the arrogance, the unshakable confidence, it all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a hollow, panicked shell. He looked from Olivia's cold, determined face to Bianca's, which was now a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He had walked into this room, a king ready to claim his new kingdom, but he had forgotten about the queen. And she had just walked back into the castle and announced that she owned the throne, the bricks, and the land for miles around. The meeting he had called to cement his legacy was about to become his execution. For a full minute, the only sound in the boardroom was the frantic, panicked rhythm of Nicholas Valmont's breathing. He stared at Olivia, his mind reeling. The supportive wife, the art historian, the woman he had dismissed as a decorative accessory to his life, was now seated across from him, holding the fate of his entire world in her hands. "This is a joke," he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Some kind of vindictive trick." "I assure you, Mr. Valmont, the SEC filings are no joke," Samuel Davies said, dryly gesturing to the documents before him. "The Bennett Trust holds 51% of all voting shares. My client controls this company, and therefore she controls this meeting." Olivia let the weight of that statement settle. She looked around the table, her gaze pausing on each board member before finally landing back on her husband. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice a model of icy composure, "I'd like to make a motion. I move to reject the proposed acquisition of Cybercore Dynamics, effective immediately." Andrew Peterson seconded the motion before the words were fully out of her mouth. "I second." "You can't do that," Nick exploded, slamming his fist on the table. "We have a deal. This is the future of the company." "Is it?" Nicholas. Olivia countered, her voice dangerously soft. She slid a financial summary across the table, one prepared by Davies. is a future of crippling debt, mass layoffs of loyal Ethelred employees, and a $30 million synergy bonus paid directly to you and your executive team really what's best for this company? Or is it just what's best for you? Ms. Chen picked up the summary, her eyes scanning the damning figures. She looked from the paper to Nick, her expression hardening. The charm had worn off. All she saw now was the greed. "I call for a vote," Olivia stated. "All in favor of rejecting the Cybercore acquisition." Her own hand went up. Samuel Davies raised his beside hers, representing her proxy. Andrew Peterson's hand shot up. After a moment's hesitation, Ms. Chen raised hers, followed by 2 other board members who had clearly been swayed by the new reality. It was a landslide. Nick watched aghast as his magnum opus, his legacy-defining deal, was dismantled in less than 5 minutes. He was utterly powerless. "The motion carries," Olivia announced into the stunned silence. "The Cybercore deal is dead." She then turned her gaze to the woman in the white suit who had been watching the proceedings with a growing sense of dread. "Now for our second item of business," Olivia continued, her tone becoming even colder. "Corporate espionage." Bianca Reed went rigid. "Mr. Peterson," Olivia prompted, "if you would." Andrew Peterson, no longer a waffling dinosaur but an avenging angel of the old guard, stood up. "Over the past several days, at the request of the majority shareholder, I initiated an internal investigation into a potential security breach. The investigation uncovered a systematic, ongoing effort to leak proprietary research and development data, specifically the source code and schematics for our patented Helios Logistics AI, to a direct competitor, Omnicorp." He placed a thick file on the table and opened it. "We have recovered encrypted emails, tracked illicit financial transfers, and have a full forensic analysis of the network activity. The source of the leak has been identified." He paused for dramatic effect, looking directly at Bianca. The data was being transferred from the workstation and personal devices of Ms. Bianca Reed. A collective gasp went through the room. Bianca shot to her feet, her face ashen. "That's a lie. It's absurd. This is a fabrication." Nick stared at her, a dawning horror on his face. He remembered her late nights, her obsession with the Helios project, her private calls. He had seen it as ambition. Now he saw it as treason. The woman he had cast his wife aside for hadn't been his partner. She had been his saboteur. "Is it, Olivia?" said her voice, cutting through Bianca's denials. She nodded at Davies, who tapped a key on his laptop. A screen on the boardroom wall flickered to life, displaying a single damning email from Bianca to a senior executive at Omnicorp. Its subject line was "Helios Final Schematics, Wire Transfer Confirmation." The room fell into a deathly hush. Bianca sank back into her chair, utterly exposed. "Security, Olivia," said her voice, ringing with command. 2 guards who had been waiting discreetly outside the doors entered the room. "Please escort Ms. Reed from the premises. Her access is to be revoked immediately. Our legal team will be in contact with her and with the district attorney's office." As the guards took a non-protesting, completely broken Bianca by the arms and led her out, Olivia's eyes met Nick's across the table. In his gaze, she saw the complete and utter collapse of a man. He had lost his deal, his mistress, and his reputation in the span of 15 minutes. All that was left was the company he had tried to break, now owned by the wife he had tried to destroy. And finally, Olivia said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, "We need to discuss the future leadership of Ethelred Technologies. I believe it's clear that a change is needed. A change that prioritizes integrity, loyalty, and a vision that honors the legacy of George Valmont rather than plundering it." She looked at her husband, the man who had humiliated her, underestimated her, and betrayed her in every conceivable way. She held all the power. She could have fired him on the spot, dragged his name through the mud, and annihilated what little he had left. But revenge, she was learning, was not about destruction. It was about building something better from the ashes. I am calling for a vote of no confidence in CEO Nicholas Valmont, she announced. And I am proposing an interim CEO, effective immediately to guide us through this transition, Mr. Andrew Peterson. Nick didn't even wait for the vote. He knew it was over. Pushing his chair back with a scraping sound that echoed his own grating defeat, he stood up. He didn't look at anyone. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the boardroom, a king leaving his own execution, stripped of his crown, his power, and his pride. The doors swung shut behind him, leaving Olivia Bennet, the true shareholder, in complete control. In the weeks that followed, the boardroom reckoning, the story became the stuff of New York legend. Whispers at cocktail parties and bold headlines in financial journals told a tale of high-stakes drama, the fall of the arrogant CEO, the corporate spy in a designer suit, and the emergence of the quiet, mysterious wife who turned out to be the most powerful person in the room. Nicholas Valmont vanished from public life. He was forced to resign in disgrace, his name toxic in the circles he once dominated. Stripped of his CEO title and salary, facing a lawsuit from the company for gross negligence, and publicly shamed, he retreated to a life of obscurity. The divorce was swift and silent. He took a small settlement, a pittance, compared to what he once had, and Olivia never saw him again. Bianca Reed fared worse, facing federal charges for corporate espionage. But Olivia had no time to gloat. She had a company to rebuild. Working alongside the newly appointed CEO Andrew Peterson, she plunged herself into the heart of Aethelred Technologies. She wasn't a figurehead shareholder. She was an active driving force. She walked the floors of the R&D labs, talking to the engineers her grandfather had so admired. She met with department heads, listening to their ideas and concerns. She dismantled the toxic, ego-driven culture Nick had fostered and began to replace it with one based on collaboration, innovation, and integrity. Her first major act as the controlling shareholder was to kill all plans for layoffs. Instead, she announced a new initiative, the George Valmont Innovation Fund, a multi-million-dollar internal program to fund promising employee projects, the very kind of forward-thinking investment Nick had always cut in favor of flashier short-term gains. The move sent a shockwave of renewed loyalty and morale through the company. She sold the cold minimalist penthouse overlooking the park and made her grandfather's house in the Hudson Valley her permanent home, commuting to the city when needed. The house was no longer a place of grief, but a sanctuary of strength and legacy. She turned her grandfather's study into her own, the old leather ledger, sitting on the desk as a constant reminder of the quiet power of wisdom and patience. As her pregnancy progressed, her presence at the company became a powerful symbol. Here was a woman not choosing between family and career, but seamlessly integrating them. She was building a future on two fronts, a healthy, ethical company and a safe, loving home for her child. She wasn't just fixing the house Nick broke. She was building an entirely new foundation, one that was strong, true, and entirely her own. One crisp autumn afternoon, she stood in her office, the one that had once been Nick's, looking out at the panoramic view of the city. Andrew Peterson entered, holding a new product prototype. The engineering team is calling it the Bennet Lens, he said with a warm smile. A new way of seeing things. They thought it was fitting. Olivia smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She placed a hand on her prominent baby bump, feeling the strong, steady kick of the new life within her. She had endured the deepest public humiliation, the most painful personal betrayal. She had walked through the fire and had not been consumed. Instead, she had been forged into something stronger, something unbreakable. She was no longer Mrs. Nicholas Valmont, the perfect wife in a gilded cage. She was Olivia Bennet, the woman who had turned her inheritance into a declaration of independence. Looking out at the endless expanse of the city, she felt a profound sense of peace. The past was a scar, but the future was a blueprint, and for the first time, she was the sole architect. And she was just getting started. And so Olivia's story isn't just about the fall of a cheating husband, but the rise of a queen who discovered her own power when she had nothing left to lose. It's a powerful reminder that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding all the cards, and that the deepest betrayals can sometimes lead to our greatest triumphs. True strength isn't about the life you are given, but about the one you have the courage to build from the rubble. She didn't just reclaim her life, she rebuilt an entire legacy for herself and her child. If Olivia's incredible journey from heartbreak to the boardroom moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life stories of justice and empowerment. What did you think of Nick's ultimate downfall? Let us know in the comments below,